Well, thank you very much for this opportunity, and to Tristram as well. I'm not sure that to use, I think it was Sebastian's felicitous phrase, I'm not sure we found the switch to the floodlights, but we did wave a bedroom torch around a little. So hopefully there's been some sporadic light shown or thrown on a really very complex landscape that is perhaps a little bit different from the other sessions. We were invited to look at criminal conflict and political violence. And so perhaps the focus was a little bit more, well, both global, but also kind of local within the globe. And I'm afraid we were sort of resolutely low tech. Cybercrime didn't really kind of feature that highly for reasons that perhaps will become clear. But we were particularly interested in looking at the sort of drivers and supply side of how some criminal behavior overlaps with political activity as well in both directions, and some really extraordinary papers really based upon some very impressive kind of ethnographic field work. And I'm not sure I'll do them full justice. I feel a bit like a sort of wedding singer, giving you a kind of poor cover version of some classic hits, but I'll do my best. I think perhaps the first point to stress, and I hope it might come as a relief, is that really for a series of discussions in which the academics, I'm afraid, did sort of dominate quite a lot, we really didn't spend much time talking about definitions at all. If anything, we actually sort of were very much of the mind that some of the sort of working definitions that we've tended to inherit have actually been part of the problem. And even a sort of, basic conceit like the terror crime nexus, which does rather suggest two distinct phenomena being bolted together, is actually problematic. We're sort of primed to expect incongruity when that may not be the local reality at all. So, at what point do we decide the ideal types are less than ideal and actually bin them? So this, really, I suppose the first point is about kind of conceptual clearing of the undergrowth. Is this assumed distinction and dichotomy between criminal behavior and political behavior often just does not seem to make much sense of various local milieu around the world. And if I can give it a shout out, Raphael Lefebvre's extraordinary study, Jihad in the City, about Tripoli, Lebanon, not Tripoli, Libya. But that study, which he spoke about a little bit on the background, really does a really amazing job of showing how certain neighborhoods with a very strong sense of communal solidarity, poor economic opportunities, involvement in organized crime, have really sort of thrown up movements that have looked very ideological and transnational, and to some extent sincerely have been, but also have switched really very radically about 40 years ago from a sort of Marxist agenda to an Islamist agenda in ways that seem, really very surprising. But really what that book does, I think, in a very useful way, and Raphael's paper to us too, was kind of problematize why shouldn't these things belong together? It's a sort of not a helpful set of assumptions always to assume that they are distinct. So in many ways, a lot of the presentations were, and indeed the snapshots were really about exploring, to use that kind of horribly awkward phrase that came in, about 25 years ago, the global, the global/local phenomena. But I suppose if there is a sort of takeaway from that kind of ethnographic field work, it's that the global is still infinitely local in its variety. In other words, globalized forces are clearly acting to create many of these environments, which then produce some very problematic behavior, but they do so in very heterogeneous and varied ways. And for many of the actors, the neighborhood is still the primary. The neighborhood is still the primary stage and locus of action, even though, of course, all of these neighborhoods are strung together in global nodes as well. So. I think the Home Secretary, or the former Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, was, quoted from 2018 saying, these thing about these threats we're talking about is they know no borders. Actually, when you look locally, borders are really important. The way these neighborhoods work is enormously significant to the actors within them and how they act politically, and often very, very bounded. Different neighborhoods will react in different ways. And one of the wonderful studies we've had was from Nick Barnes. Forgive the shout out, but just become a St Andrews colleague in the last year. Nick's done some amazing work in Rio de Janeiro neighborhoods, looking at really a sort of almost a kind of counterinsurgency type model to suppress organized crime that really got very, very different reactions from neighborhoods cheek by jowl. So in some areas, organized crime groups did fight back and contest it. Much more often, they sort of melted back into the shadows and just waited out the state. They thought they had a stamina. And they were right that this basically military occupation was not sustainable indefinitely. And when the troops were pulled back off the streets, they could then go back to what they were doing, which sort of leads on, I think, to the sort of next point, something that Vander Felwood-Brown, who seems to have done fieldwork just about everywhere, I say admiringly and vaguely, but I mean, really, full respect, has really stressed is that, very often, I think, from a sort of UK perspective, we come in assuming that non-state actors are inherently and automatically illegitimate, and they may not be at all. And this is one of the really difficult things to try and get one's head around, and indeed to disentangle analytically, because of course they are often organized crime groups are going to be coercive actors. But it doesn't necessarily mean there isn't some degree of local tolerance, even popularity and support. And the reason that there often is, if I can generalize between these very, very different local dynamics that I've already indexed, is, some very deep structural reasons to do with how states in certain parts of the world work, and the way in which states and markets are clearly not meeting primary human needs. So to give an example would be sort of housing in Rio. The model there for the organized crime groups is preservation and active maintenance of poverty. It's essentially warehousing people, giving them poor houses, and then overcharging them for necessary maintenance. So they're then dependent upon you. These are clearly things that one would hope the state or the market would do, but isn't. And they are therefore meeting a legitimate need to some degree, sometimes actually getting kudos and popularity for it, at least tolerance. And that's not necessarily a model that we're kind of primed to expect or detect very easily, but it needs to be, I think, confronted squarely, or we really won't understand what's going on here. So often, we're talking about terminology that may just look very, very different. Brazil obviously is a democracy, but if you actually look at how sort of democratic access, if I can put it that way, to certain areas of Rio work, is often you have your organized crime groups. As I say, they're the ones that have drained the marshes, built, gone in for illicit urbanization, provided some sort of housing, and then one of their kind of rentier strategies really is to charge local politicians and bosses to the sort of rent effectively to campaign there and get votes. So these communities are essentially used as kind of fish ponds of voters, if I can put it that way. And of course they'll be doing other stuff as well. And there, some very interesting distinctions made between different types of non-state groups that might control these types of areas. One has the kind of more old-fashioned drug cartels, but increasingly in many areas of Rio, they've actually been driven out. They've been driven out by militias who are, often ex-police officers, or certainly with links to the security forces. And they may not tolerate drugs as much, but they deliver security in kind of one sense, and to that extent get legitimacy. But it's a very repressive sort of order, and local businesses will be taxed at double the rate, and so on and so forth. So there are kind of different types of headache one can, well, not choose from, but one can find imposed upon one if one is living in these kind of areas. But the general point that states are either often distant, and the ability to actually fix things, provide housing of some sort, or deliver quote unquote justice, is I think a key point. These are not ungoverned spaces. If anything, they are multiply governed spaces. That's the sort of point to try and get one's head around. Okay, so I've talked a little bit then about really a sort of key conceptual challenge that kind of confronted us early on, which is to problematize the idea that the state is kind of on the side of a lot of forces that we want to see, and that these other actors are not, because that may lead us into all kinds of errors of analysis and dead ends. There was some also really, I think, very impressive work from Kate Ferguson, looking at things a bit differently. And so instead of looking at sort of some pretty well-organized criminal groups that develop political interest, she was looking more at politics of identity, particularly driven by states from the top down, and really making the point that when we look at mass atrocities, let's not argue over definitions, but loosely ethnic cleansing, genocide, whatever, these kind of mass horrors, it's not an accident that criminals are absolutely in the front rank and they're the ones kind of driving it and leading it. And we've tended to kind of see such awful phenomena as either part of an armed conflict of war, or perhaps specifically driven by ideology. The long shadow of the Nazis is often in our heads. And these things may be there, of course, but there may also be just a co-production with other interests, and that actually there's a kind of dynamic kleptocracy, if I can put it that way, that is driving these processes. The looting is not incidental. The looting may actually be much more intrinsic, maybe actually be the motor to some of these processes. And that, if we're to understand them, getting our heads around the sort of political and financial logic of modern atrocity might be a very useful way forward. And it's interesting to see that I think Kate, I don't want to put words in her mouth, because it's going back actually to a blog she published a few months ago in March of this year, talking about the government's integrated review, and basically cautiously welcoming it, saying it does actually sort of live up to what it says it will do. This kind of melding of kind of analytical categories, this kind of bonfire of definitions I talked about of crime and politics, might actually be enormously helpful for detecting early warning signs, because basically our reaction to those kind of atrocities has been, pretty lamentably reactive and belated often, because we're often caught on the wrong foot, it seems, and the process is already underway before we recognize what's actually going on. Okay, so that has, how am I doing for time? I'm aware that I've hopefully got a couple more minutes yet. We also did look a little bit closer to home, in which there is an interesting pattern that I think has begun to spark some insightful research into the relationship between particularly Islamist terrorism in whatever we want to call it, global north, or Western European countries and so on, and criminal links. Again, it just feels like a St. Andrew's shout out, doesn't it? But my colleague here, Javier Argamanes, has done good work on that. And I think Martin Gallagher too did one of the snapshots on that sort of pattern, where what seem to be puzzling links sometimes make a lot more sense if one actually understands a little bit about prosopography, about group biography, about who might get involved in grassroots Islamist terrorism, and that they might come from the same kind of deprived neighborhoods where, frankly, technicians of illegal violence find each other, and skills in getting illegal guns and that sort of thing are sort of social capital that is freely available. But there is also an interesting dynamic, I think, in that subculture of a sort of redemptive turn. The idea that, yes, you might have been involved in some dodgy stuff, but if you join this movement, you'll either be kind of absolved for that prior activity, or that prior activity will be redirected to a higher cause that is noble and self-sacrificing. And I think we need not to neglect culture. I was struck, and this is my riff. This is me embellishing this is the cover version, embellishing the original. So I hope I'm not going too off piece. But I was struck by the sort of links actually with loyalist crime in Northern Ireland, where it's almost an opposite dynamic. The idea there is, if you've been involved in that kind of subtext, it's a recognized route out that you should sort of turn to evangelical Christianity, and that's a sort of recognized cultural pathway out of that kind of subculture into something that's a bit more kind of socially acceptable. But in some of the Islamist kind of subcultures, that doesn't seem to be the way it works, even though one can sort of see similarities. So a sort of regret to kind of individuals who are psychologically vulnerable to lives that have really been pretty unfulfilling and seen and done some pretty horrible stuff, can be somehow a cause can be bolted onto that and redirect that activity in ways that are can potentially very destructive. And also worth just saying, a lot of those kind of campaigns terrorism is notoriously a cheap form of warfare. So the sort of petty crime can actually go a long way to funding some pretty horrible attacks. Okay, I've talked a lot about the local within the global, but also we can't neglect the global chains that we've been talking about, of course. And I think there was some interesting contributions made here. One of the snapshots, Fausto Carbajal Glass was talking about at a wide-angled kind of perspective. If one looks at, say, illegal logging, illegal mining in Mexico, if it's on a big enough scale, a sort of the canary in the coal mine, the early warning system, it might be sort of market fluctuations. So that was it's kind of pretty wide angle, but it's kind of an interesting idea that actually, if this stuff is really ramping up, that might be the first place you notice it, is in sort of share prices and so on, or how these commodities are trading. A slightly more sort of, or rather more kind of forensic analysis that was pretty impressive came from Annette Eidler, who's worked a lot on Colombia and on the links between international transnational crime and civil conflicts and in long-running insurgencies. And I think she had a very interesting way of looking at it. She sort of made the basic distinction that actually a lot of organized crime is not really that organized. I mean, it's kind of ad hoc and short term, and the drug deal is done, and then the partners go and find other partners. But if we sort of narrow the focus and we look at long-term relationships and try and trace illicit chains out of areas of rebel governance, as the fashionable phrase now is, if we look at them and look at long-term relationships, if we're going to see how growers and suppliers are linked, there are always key brokers. And if we can identify them, we might be a big step forward towards creating really sort of disruptive concatenations of when we intervene. And she made the point that, one of those key brokers was taken out in Colombia recently, apparently, and it did noticeably the trade has, I think to the States, has not actually recovered, although if you do take out a key broker, the usual short-term effect is a spike in violence as the crime cartels or whatever fight it out as to who's going to get that market. So it's not all good news. But I think she's really offered a very forensic way of looking at supply chains in ways that seem impressively targeted in understanding what the key nodes and players are. So lurching towards some sort of conclusion, I guess we started off with really quite a broad, wide-ranging and frankly very lively discussion in which I sort of felt like I was the kind of nuclear physician with the graphite rods trying to control the reaction, in which really, one of the big questions in front of us from a sort of UK Western government point of view is, well, what's the horizon of ambition? To work with these kind of governments in certain parts of the world, what are we trying to do? What's realistic against what really is a crisis of global governance, of compromised governments all around the world? And Vanda was, really quite powerful on sort of being realistic as she saw it and reducing expectations, and then other people were pushing back. So that was kind of a huge debate, really, and in many ways, I think we'll all have different answers depending on our political and ideological preferences. So I just flag that up without getting too into it. But I think it is important to stress just the scale of the potential challenge on a much more kind of focus level. And this wasn't. I loved the kind of the badging of undermining. That kind of was nicely subversive. I'm not sure in our case. I think we're still at an earlier stage of understanding some of the problems, to be honest. So I think we may have been top heavy on trying to understand, but I think there were some really quite helpful, more targeted suggestions, especially about trying to get ahead of curves of processes. I've already mentioned Kate Ferguson and her talking about, the sort of pivot to prevention of, can we actually use the behavior of organized criminals as an early warning sign of what could be horrendous mass atrocities and ethnic cleansing? What are they doing? Can we keep an eye on them? And also, I say the looking at sort of market fluctuations and resource extraction illegally. So there's some interesting, there are some interesting ideas there. I think there's also, Annette's work, I think, is very impressive in terms of actually seeing, where does one, this sounds like this echoes other useful discussions that have been happening in parallel, but we need to map and conceptualize supply chains with far sharper focus than we seem to have done so far. I'm aware that I've banged on for a good bit.
Tim, that's great.
Apologies if I've just served you up a rich audit of my own uncertainties, but that
no. And to reassure you, you were certainly not a cheap wedding singer banging out previous hits. So thank you.